Is Jesus the angel of the Lord? All right, here we go again, guys.
לך דודי לקראת כלה פני שבת.
Antonio Reed, and welcome to this episode of the Tipple Podcast. So, what I want to do is not so much focus in on Alex O'Connor's response, but what Godlogic is saying to Alex O'Connor in response to what he said to his retort. Now, this is very interesting. It is very striking, the argument that Godlogic uses. What Godlogic will say is that the angel of the Lord that we are presented to in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, is in fact the Jesus of the New Testament. And this is incredible because, of course, there's nothing like that in the Hebrew Bible to suggest that Jesus or the Messiah is in fact the angel of the Lord yet to be revealed. But what's interesting here is that in my last video, people said that I totally had missed Godlogic's point that he was making in his question. So what I want to do here is home in on what his point actually is and tackle it as it's being presented to us.
Jesus, according to Hebrews 1, pre-existed, right, as God's son, separate and exalted over the angels. I'm glad that you highlight that. But that same point is what you're missing. Who Jesus pre-existed as is the point. That's the very point. The fact that he pre-existed as the Son who reveals the Father, who makes the Father known, who created all things and created the heavens and the earth, who is unchanging, that right there shows you who he was back then, being active with the prophets, revealing himself to the prophets. For example, your point was that, God spoke to the prophets in many ways, right? But in these last days, he speaks to us through his son. However, that doesn't mean that he wasn't also speaking to the prophets through his son. It literally says this: long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the worlds. Notice how it says that God spoke at many times and in many ways to our fathers by the prophets, right? That's now, how does he speak by the prophets? You have the angel of the Lord coming to the prophets, right? You have many ways that God is speaking by the prophets to the fathers. And so this doesn't negate that one of those many ways is the Son.
So I certainly agree with Alex's point and with most biblical commentators here that the book of Hebrews certainly does possess a very high Christology. For the author of the book of Hebrews, Jesus is pre-existent as the God the Son. And so for the book of Hebrews, of course, he has the extraordinary Christology much higher than the Christologies that, for example, we'll find in the book of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and something like what we'll find in par in the book of John. For the book of Hebrews, Jesus is the divine instrument through which God brings the world into being. Jesus is the asset that God uses to create the universe. So that's a very high and powerful and exalted role. And we are even told in the book of Hebrews, contrary to what Godlogic is arguing, is that Jesus is not an angel, that he is exalted above the angels. And in fact, the book of Hebrews says, of the angels, which did God say, you are my begotten son? And that is because for the book of Hebrews, the author wants us to know that Jesus is not an angel. He's something beyond an angel. For the author of the book of Hebrews, in Justin Martyr's language, Jesus is a second God. Now, of course, Godlogic doesn't want to say that because that's really upsetting for him. So what instead he argues is that Jesus being pre-existent as the Son of God means that he therefore is the angel of the Lord. Well, there's nothing, not only, of course, in the Hebrew Bible to suggest anything like that, there's nothing in the other 26 books in the New Testament outside the book of Hebrews to even suggest that. And of course, the book book of Hebrews doesn't even suggest that. That is an argument that actually Justin Martyr, a second century Ante-Nicene church father, will make in his argument with Trypho the Jew in his book Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, when he's trying to convince Trypho that Jesus is in fact the Jewish Messiah. And one of the ways that he tries to do that is by saying that Jesus essentially is this Christophany, and a Christophany is an appearance of Jesus before his announced identification as Jesus the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. And so what Justin Martyr will argue is that what we're seeing here is that the angel of the Lord is in fact an incarnate, pre-incarnate version of Jesus. But we know this argument doesn't make any sense because, interestingly enough, in the book of Matthew, in the Christmas narrative, Joseph is visited by the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord tells Joseph that he has to get baby Jesus out of the wrath of King Herod. So think about how interesting this is. If Godlogic is correct, that means a pre-carnate version of Jesus as the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph and told Joseph to take the incarnate version of baby Jesus away from King Herod down to Egypt, as to get away from the fact that King Herod is trying to kill all of the Jewish males. This is absolutely extraordinary and it doesn't make any sense. But nonetheless, this is the pretzel that people like Godlogic end up tying themselves in, and Justin Martyr, of course, when they try to inject Jesus into the Hebrew Bible by making this erroneous claim that Jesus is, in fact, the angel of the Lord. Now, again, the example that Godlogic will use that Jesus is active through the angel of the Lord in the Hebrew Bible and in the time of Moses is Hebrews 11:26, where Moses is supposedly having said that he had considered the suffering of Jesus on the Roman cross, his Catholic atonement death, his universal death, more than all of the riches of Egypt. Well, my response video, I asked people, go back to the Hebrew Bible. Go to all of the verses where Moses is encountering God, encountering the angel of the Lord, or is speaking to the Israelites, and see if there's any such dialogue that's even close to anything like what's being said in Hebrews 11:26. And what you'll find is absolutely nothing like what's being reported in the book of Hebrews. And so the bedrock example that Godlogic is using to show that Jesus was active through the angel of the Lord in the time of Moses doesn't exist. That's the crucial point here. So although he will make this argument that Jesus is the angel of the Lord, the one example that he's using to show that Jesus was active in the time of Moses just doesn't exist in the Hebrew Bible. Moses doesn't ever say anything like that he understood that the Messiah would die on the Roman cross and be chastised by Pontius Pilate and rise on the third day in a Catholic atoning way, a ransom for our sins. He doesn't say anything like that. And he doesn't have that conversation with the angel of the Lord. That is simply something that the book of Hebrews, that the author of the book of Hebrews is injecting into his argument to advance his point. That's all that's going on here. And that's what I pointed out in my last video. But let's continue to give Godlogic more of an ear here to see what else he has to say.
Just like in these last days, he's spoken to us by his son. That doesn't negate that he also uses prophets as well, because literally Jesus says in Matthew 23, he says, therefore, I send you prophets and scribes. And we see in the book of Acts that prophets are around and they're being used to speak to Paul, for example, and others. Prophets are still being used, but the revelation is through the Son. So it's not negating that the Son was speaking back then in the book of Hebrews.
Here, Godlogic's argument appears to be that although God uses prophets to speak through, it is only the Son, who Godlogic is calling the angel of the Lord in the Hebrew Bible, that the revelation of God is revealed through. Now, this is interesting because there's no evidence of this in the Hebrew Bible. For example, on Yom Kippur, Jews, religious Jews, are called to read the book of Jonah. And what's interesting about the book of Jonah is that Jonah is a prophet of God, and he goes to the people of Nineveh, he goes to the people of Nineveh, and he tells them that they are to confess their sins, that they are repent and put on sackcloth in order to avoid this great calamity, this destruction from God. And of course, the people of Nineveh do that. Now, what's interesting here is this is obviously a revelation from God. What is a revelation? It is divine truth, it is divine knowledge from God of something that will happen in the future if you do or don't do a certain thing. And here, it is the prophet Jonah who's revealing this. And what's interesting is that the term Melech Hashim or Melech Elohim does not even get mentioned in the entirety of the book of Jonah. So, how is it then possible, God logic, that only the Son Jesus reveals the revelation of God when here we have a prophet clearly doing so? And we will see this time and time again where prophets will reveal the revelation of God to individuals without ever the angel of the Lord interacting with them. Now, the angel of the Lord does interact with prophets, he does interact with people in the Hebrew Bible, but he's not the only figure through which the revelation of God comes through. So I'm not exactly sure what God's logic point is here.
Now, since we acknowledge that Jesus pre-existed according to Hebrews, Hebrews 11:26 puts Jesus in the time of Moses, where Moses feared his reproach, where Moses feared the disapproval of Christ. Well, who was there traveling with Moses? Who's the one who revealed himself to Moses? Who's the one that commanded Moses to leave Egypt? That is the angel of the Lord. If you ask Moses who he saw and who was he talking to, who was he revering, he would have said the angel of Yahweh, Yahweh himself. You ask the writer of Hebrews who Moses was in fear of, who did he receive commands from? The writer of Hebrews would say, oh, that was Jesus.
Okay, so that's another interesting point that God Logic is making. First, it's important to be a little bit nuanced here. Just because the author of the book of Hebrews sees that Jesus pre-existed his birth, his divine conception and virgin birth as the Son of God, doesn't mean that he pre-existed as a pre-incarnate form in the angel of the Lord. That is an argument that God Logic is making that's not evident anywhere in the text. And in fact, as I said earlier, the author of the book of Hebrews doesn't make that point that Jesus is the angel of the Lord. And in Hebrews 11:26, when Moses is, well, when the author of the book of Hebrews is claiming that Moses had considered the chastisement and disgrace of Jesus greater than all the riches of Egypt, this is something that the author of the book of Hebrews is saying, but all this could be is a revelation from an angel of God to Moses. It doesn't have to be Jesus himself that is revealing that information. It could just be an angel. I don't see why it has, there's no logical reason why it has to be Jesus who's revealing this information to Moses that's in 11:6. But again, that's besides the point because what we are told in Hebrews 11:6 is not evident in the Hebrew Bible. The author of the book of Hebrews is saying that sometime during the Exodus, when Moses is encountering the angel of the Lord, this is a conversation that comes up. Again, I just beg all the Christians that are watching my video to go to the book of Exodus, read all the instances, use Chat GPT if you want to, use all the instances, look at all the instances where Moses is talking to the angel of the Lord. And I promise you, you will not find anything like Moses recognizing that the Messiah was going to be chastised by a Roman prefect and then eventually crucified and then risen from the dead. There's nothing like that in all the Torah. And in fact, there's nothing like that in the whole of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. This is just an argument that the author of the book of Hebrews is asserting. And then what God Logic is doing is using Justin Martyr's argument, a second century church father, and going even further by making an argument that exists outside of the New Testament itself, and that is that Jesus is the pre-incarnate version of the angel of the Lord. None of this is true. None of this is evident in the Hebrew Bible. And I would just beg my friends that are interested in the Hebrew Hebrew Bible, interested in the biblical text, just read the text for yourself. If there's anything like Moses had considered the suffering of Jesus greater than all of the riches in Egypt, I would be in church today.